The telegram sat on the desk for 3 full minutes before anyone picked it up. Franklin Delano Roosevelt looked at it from his wheelchair. His reading glasses sat on his nose. A half-burned cigarette rested in the ashtray beside him. His military aide, a young colonel named Harrison, stood by the door, stiff and quiet, waiting to be told what to do. Outside the Oval Office windows, Washington was stuck in one of those hot, sticky August afternoons that made everyone move slower and think less clearly. But Roosevelt wasn't slow, and he wasn't foggy. His mind was racing. It was August 14th, 1943, inside the White House in Washington, D.C. The war had been going on for 4 years. America had been in it for only 20 months since Pearl Harbor. In that time, Roosevelt had learned what total war really meant, what it cost, what it demanded. He had learned about factory targets and death counts, about planning and supply lines, about all the boring, ugly math behind winning a war, but the numbers in this telegram didn't make sense. "Colonel Harrison," Roosevelt said at last in the calm, polished voice Americans knew so well from his radio talks. "Are these numbers confirmed?" "Yes, sir. They were checked 3 times through our military office in Ottawa and confirmed by our intelligence people. The numbers are correct." Roosevelt picked up the telegram and read it again. Canada, a country of only 11.5 million people, was now building more military vehicles than Italy. They were building more ships than Japan had built in the past year. They were making more airplanes than the entire Axis had made in the last 6 months. They had trained more than 1 million men and women for military service. They were sending food to Britain in huge amounts, far more than their small population should have been able to supply. They had loaned billions of dollars to the Allied war effort, and they were not slowing down. "How is this possible?" Roosevelt said quietly. He was really talking to himself. "The math doesn't work. They shouldn't be able to keep this up." Harrison cleared his throat. "Sir, if I may, I think that's exactly why this matters. By normal economic thinking, Canada should have hit its production peak months ago. They should be running out of workers. Their resources should be stretched to the limit. But instead, they're speeding up." Roosevelt rolled his wheelchair closer to the window and looked out at the rose garden Eleanor took care of. And he thought about his own country, huge, powerful, 135 million people. America was an industrial giant, the arsenal of democracy, and everyone knew it. But Canada was doing something that almost didn't seem real. They were doing far more than anyone expected for a country their size, so much more that it broke the normal rules. He had met the Canadian Prime Minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King, several times. A strange, small, careful man. Always worried about politics, always thinking about staying in power, deeply interested in spiritual things and seances. Not the kind of leader you would expect to push a nation into a massive war effort like this. And yet, somehow, because of King or in spite of him, Canada had turned itself into a highly efficient war machine. Get me our own production reports from the War Department," Roosevelt said. "I want side-by-side comparisons, output per person, how resources are being used, how fast factories were converted, everything." "Yes, sir. Anything in particular you want to focus on?" Roosevelt turned his chair to face Harrison. "I want to know if we're doing as well as they are, for our size. And if we aren't, I want to know why the hell not." The reports arrived 2 days later. A team of analysts had worked all night to finish them. Roosevelt read them in his study. Harry Hopkins sat across from him. Hopkins was his closest advisor, thin, sickly, worn down by illness, but extremely sharp and completely loyal. "It's unbelievable," Hopkins said, flipping through the pages. "By every measure, Canada is doing better than anyone expected. They converted 92% of their car industry to making military equipment. 92%, Franklin. We've only managed 73, and we have 10 times their population." Roosevelt lit another cigarette. His doctors had told him to smoke less, but right now, there were bigger problems than that. "Look at the shipbuilding numbers," Roosevelt said, tapping one of the pages. "They're completing corvettes and cargo ships faster than we can build Liberty ships, and our program is supposed to be the fastest in history." "The Canadian yards are working triple shifts," Hopkins explained. "They've recruited women in massive numbers, trained them in weeks to do jobs that used to require years of apprenticeship. They've simplified their designs, standardized their parts, created assembly line processes for ship construction that mirror automobile manufacturing. We're doing the same thing. Yes, but they're doing it better, or at least more efficiently relative to their size." Roosevelt smoked in silence for a moment, thinking. This wasn't a competition, he reminded himself. Canada was an ally, a neighbor, a friend. Their success was his success, was everyone's success. But still, there was something almost unsettling about the numbers. It suggested a level of national commitment that even America, for all its patriotic fervor, hadn't quite matched. "What's driving this?" Roosevelt asked. "What makes a country of 11 million people perform like this?" Hopkins considered the question carefully. "I've been thinking about that. I think it's several things. First, they're genuinely afraid. Britain is their mother country, culturally and emotionally. If Britain falls, they know they're isolated in North America with us. And while we're allies, they remember we weren't always. They remember 1812. Roosevelt smiled slightly at that. The War of 1812, when America had tried to invade Canada and failed miserably, not one of the prouder moments in American history. Second, Hopkins continued, they have no choice. They're a small country that's chosen to fight a global war. They can't afford to do it halfway. If they commit, they have to commit totally, or they might as well not bother. And third, I think they're proving something. To us, to Britain, to themselves. They're not just a colonial backwater. They're a nation that matters. Every ship they build, every plane they send, every soldier they train is a statement that they belong at the table with the great powers." Roosevelt nodded slowly. That made sense. Canada had gained its independence gradually, peacefully, without the dramatic revolution that had forged American identity. They'd fought in the First World War and bled terribly for it, but even that hadn't quite established them as a truly independent nation in the eyes of the world. This war was their chance to prove themselves, and by God, they were seizing it. "I want to visit their facilities," Roosevelt said suddenly. "The factories, the training bases, the shipyards. I want to see this for myself." Hopkins raised an eyebrow. "That would be a significant diplomatic gesture. It would be seen as acknowledging their contribution in a very public way." "Good. They deserve the acknowledgement. Just set it up." The visit was arranged for late September. Roosevelt traveled by train to Montreal, where he was met by Prime Minister King and a delegation of Canadian officials. The press coverage was extensive, with photographers capturing every moment of the American president's arrival in Canada. King was nervous, as he always was around Roosevelt. The Canadian Prime Minister felt perpetually overshadowed by his American counterpart, and with good reason. Roosevelt had presence, charisma, that indefinable quality that made people listen when he spoke. King was competent and shrewd, but he'd never inspired anyone in his life. Still, King took his role as host seriously. He'd arranged a tour of Canadian facilities that would showcase their achievements without seeming boastful. It was a delicate balance, typical of King's cautious approach to everything. The first stop was a factory in Montreal that had been producing railway cars before the war. Now it made Valentine tanks, the British design that Canadian factories had adopted and improved. Roosevelt's wheelchair was brought to the factory floor, and he watched as workers assembled the vehicles with practiced efficiency. A young woman, couldn't have been more than 20, was welding armor plates onto a tank hull. She wore thick gloves and a protective mask, and her movements were confident and precise. When the tour group approached, she finished her weld, shut off her torch, and lifted her mask. "Mr. President," she said, and Roosevelt could hear the nervousness in her voice despite her attempt to sound professional. "What's your name, miss?" Roosevelt asked. "Marie Fontaine, sir? I'm from Quebec City." "How long have you been doing this work, Marie?" 6 months, sir. I was working in a dress shop before. They recruited me, trained me for 3 weeks, and I've been welding tanks ever since." Roosevelt studied the weld she'd just completed. He didn't know much about welding, but he could see it was clean and professional looking. "Do you like the work?" he asked. Marie considered the question. "It's hard, sir. Hot in summer, cold in winter. The hours are long. But yes, I like it. I'm good at it, and it matters. Every tank I help build is one more piece of armor between my brother and a German bullet." "Your brother's in the service?" "Yes, sir. Infantry. He's in Italy right now." Roosevelt nodded. "Then we'll make sure he has all the tanks he needs. Thank you for your service." Marie. They moved on through the factory. Roosevelt saw more workers, more welders and assemblers and inspectors, men and women working side by side. The factory manager explained the production statistics. They were completing 12 tanks per day, every day, 7 days a week. They'd been doing it for 18 months and showed no signs of slowing down. "What's your turnover rate?" Hopkins asked the manager. "About 4% annually, sir. Very low for wartime industry." "Why is that?" The manager shrugged. "Pride, mostly. People know they're good at what they do. They know it matters. And we pay fair wages, give them good conditions, treat them with respect. Turns out that's worth more than a few extra cents per hour." From Montreal, they traveled to Halifax, where the shipyards dominated the harbor. Here, Roosevelt saw the corvettes that Canada was producing in remarkable numbers. These were small warships designed for convoy escort duty, unglamorous but absolutely vital to keeping the Atlantic supply lines open. A grizzled shipyard supervisor named Mackenzie walked Roosevelt along the dock, pointing out the vessels in various stages of completion. "We can build one of these in 4 months now," Mackenzie said with evident pride. "When we started, it took us 9 months. We learned, got better, figured out what worked and what didn't." "How many are you building simultaneously?" Roosevelt asked. "Right now, 16. We've got capacity for 20, but we're holding some slips in reserve for repairs and refits." Roosevelt did the math in his head. If they could complete a corvette in 4 months and they had 16 under construction, that meant they were finishing 4 per month, 48 per year from this one shipyard. And there were other yards across Canada doing the same thing. "Mr. Mackenzie," Roosevelt said, "I'm curious about something. How do you maintain quality control at this pace? How do you make sure these ships are actually seaworthy and combat ready?" Mackenzie smiled, showing teeth stained by tobacco. "That's the question, isn't it? Answer is, we test everything. Every weld gets inspected. Every system gets checked. We do sea trials on every vessel before we hand it over to the Navy. Sure, we're building fast, but we're not cutting corners. A ship that sinks because of poor construction is worse than no ship at all." They toured one of the corvettes that was nearly complete. Roosevelt's wheelchair couldn't navigate the narrow companionways, so he was carried aboard by Secret Service agents, something he hated but accepted as necessary. The vessel was cramped, Spartan, designed for function rather than comfort, but everything was solidly built, professionally installed, clearly made to last. The captain who would take command of the vessel was there, a young lieutenant commander named Peterson. He showed Roosevelt the bridge, the engine room, the crew quarters. "She's not pretty," Peterson said, "but she'll do the job. These corvettes are tough little ships. They roll like hell in heavy seas, but they can take a beating and keep going." "Have you commanded one before?" Roosevelt asked. "Yes, sir. My last ship was sunk by a U-boat 6 months ago. Took a torpedo amidships. We lost 18 men, but the rest of us made it to lifeboats. We were picked up by another corvette 12 hours later." "I'm sorry for your losses," Roosevelt said quietly. "Thank you, sir. But that's why I'm eager to take this one out. Every U-boat we sink means fewer convoys attacked, fewer ships lost, fewer men drowned. It's personal now." From Halifax, they flew to Toronto, where Roosevelt visited an aircraft factory that had been expanded from a small operation, making training planes into a massive facility producing Lancaster bombers under license from Britain. The factory floor seemed to stretch forever, with bomber fuselages in long rows like enormous insects waiting to receive their wings. The factory director was a woman, Margaret Henderson, which surprised Roosevelt, though he tried not to show it. She was in her 50s, gray-haired and formidable, indeed with the bearing of someone who'd spent her life refusing to accept limits. "Before the war, I ran a textile factory," Henderson explained as she led Roosevelt through the facility. "Made uniforms for the railways. When the war started, the government asked if I could convert to military production. I said yes. They shut down my textile operation and gave me this factory to manage." "That's quite a transition," Roosevelt observed. "Yes and no. Manufacturing is manufacturing. You have inputs, processes, outputs. You have workers who need training and supervision. You have quality standards to maintain. The specific product changes, but the fundamental management doesn't." They stopped beside a bomber that was nearly complete. Technicians were installing the electrical systems, running wires through the fuselage with careful precision. "How many of these do you produce?" Roosevelt asked. "We're averaging 6 per week right now. Our target is 8. We'll hit it by the end of the year." 6 per week meant over 300 per year. Roosevelt knew the Lancaster was one of the best heavy bombers in the war, capable of carrying enormous bomb loads deep into German territory. 300 Lancasters represented a significant striking force. "Where do they go once they're complete?" Hopkins asked. "Most go to the RCAF squadrons overseas," Henderson said. "Some go to the RAF under transfer agreements. A few stay here for training purposes." They watched the workers for a while. Roosevelt noticed that at least half were women, and most of those were young, in their 20s and 30s. They worked with the same focused efficiency he'd seen at the tank factory, the same sense of purpose. "Mrs. Henderson," Roosevelt said, "may I ask you something candidly?" "Of course, Mr. President." "How long can this pace be sustained? Your country has been mobilized for 4 years. You're running multiple shifts, working your population at full capacity. At some point, doesn't something have to give?" Henderson smiled slightly. "You're asking if we're going to burn out. If we're going to hit a wall where we simply can't continue? Essentially, yes. She considered her answer carefully. I won't lie to you, Mr. President. It's hard. People are tired. We've had 4 years of rationing, of long hours, of families separated. The strain is real. But you're asking the wrong question. What should I be asking? You should be asking what we're fighting for, whether the cause is worth the cost. And for most Canadians, the answer is yes. Overwhelmingly, yes. We've seen what fascism means. We've heard the stories from Europe. We know what happens if Hitler wins. So we keep working. We keep building. We keep fighting. Not because it's easy, but because the alternative is unthinkable. Roosevelt nodded slowly. How long could you maintain this production level if you had to? Henderson didn't hesitate. As long as it takes, Mr. President, we'll build planes until there are no more Germans to bomb, or until we run out of materials, whichever comes first. And frankly, I think we'll outlast them. That evening, Roosevelt dined with Prime Minister King and several Canadian cabinet ministers at the Prime Minister's residence in Ottawa. The conversation was polite, diplomatic, and full of the usual platitudes about Allied cooperation and shared sacrifice. But after dinner, when the other guests had departed and only King, Roosevelt, and Hopkins remained, the conversation became more candid. They sat in King's study, Roosevelt in his wheelchair with a brandy, King in an armchair looking nervous as always, Hopkins on the sofa taking notes. William, Roosevelt said, using King's first name in a gesture of informality, I need to understand something. The production numbers I'm seeing from Canada are extraordinary. They suggest a level of mobilization that should be unsustainable. But everywhere I've gone, I've seen no signs of collapse or even serious strain. Your workers seem determined. Your factories are efficient. Your quality remains high. How are you doing this? King shifted uncomfortably. But he never liked being put on the spot, even by a friend. It's not any one thing, Franklin, King said. It's many factors working together. We have a relatively homogeneous population that's committed to the cause. We have abundant natural resources. We have strong industrial capacity built up in peacetime. We have good relations with labor unions, so we've avoided most of the strikes and disruptions that plague other countries. But other countries have those things too, Roosevelt pressed. Britain has all of that, and they're running on fumes. The Soviet Union has unlimited manpower and resources, but their production is chaotic. What's different about Canada? King was silent for a long moment. Finally, he said, I think it's because we have something to prove. Explain. We're not a great power, Franklin. We're not Britain or America or Russia. We're a middle power, a secondary player in global affairs. Everyone knows it, including us. But in this war, we've had the opportunity to show that we matter, that we can contribute meaningfully to victory, that we're not just Britain's loyal dominion or America's northern neighbor, but a nation in our own right with capabilities that demand respect. King leaned forward, warming to his theme in a way he rarely did. Every tank we build, every ship we launch, every plane we send overseas is a statement of Canadian identity. It says we belong at the table with the great powers. It says we're not spectators or bystanders, but active participants in shaping the world. That's worth something, Franklin. That's worth the sacrifice and the strain and the exhaustion. Roosevelt studied King's face. The little prime minister was more animated than Roosevelt had ever seen him, his usual caution temporarily set aside. And you believe this can be sustained? Roosevelt asked. I believe it must be sustained, King replied, because if we falter now, if we fail to maintain our contribution, we'll lose the moral authority we've earned. We'll be relegated back to secondary status, and all this sacrifice will have been for nothing beyond the military contribution itself. Hopkins spoke up from the sofa. Prime Minister, what happens after the war, when this industrial capacity is no longer needed for military production? King smiled thinly. That, Mr. Hopkins, is the question that keeps me awake at night. We'll have 1 million men and women to demobilize. We'll have factories that need to convert back to peacetime production. We'll have debts to repay and an economy to restructure. It's going to be difficult, but that's a problem for tomorrow. Today, we focus on winning. The next morning, Roosevelt departed Ottawa for Washington. As his train rolled south through the countryside, he sat in his private car with Hopkins, reviewing notes and discussing what they'd seen. They can fight forever, Roosevelt said suddenly. That's what I realized. Not literally forever, of course, but longer than Hitler can, longer than the Axis can sustain their war machine. The Canadians have found a way to mobilize their entire society without breaking it. They've created a system that's efficient, sustainable, and actually builds momentum over time rather than depleting it. Hopkins nodded. The question is whether we can do the same, whether we can learn from their example. We're already doing it, Harry. We're the arsenal of democracy. Our production dwarfs Canada's in absolute terms. But not in relative terms, not per capita. They're outperforming us by that metric, Franklin, which means either they're doing something we're not or we're leaving capacity on the table. Roosevelt knew Hopkins was right. America was powerful, but it wasn't fully mobilized, not the way Canada was. There were still luxury goods being produced. There were still workers in non-essential industries. There was still significant wealth being hoarded rather than invested in the war effort. The American people won't accept total mobilization, Roosevelt said. They'll support the war effort. They'll buy war bonds. They'll send their sons to fight. But they won't accept the kind of comprehensive rationing and industrial conversion that Canada has implemented. We're too big, too diverse, too individualistic. Maybe, Hopkins said, or maybe we just haven't explained it properly. Maybe we haven't made the case that total mobilization is necessary. Roosevelt thought about Marie Fontaine welding tanks in Montreal, about Margaret Henderson managing her bomber factory, about the shipyard workers in Halifax building corvettes in 4 months instead of 9. All of them working at maximum capacity, all of them knowing exactly why it mattered. We need to do better, Roosevelt said quietly. We need to learn from what the Canadians are doing and apply it to our own situation. Not copy them exactly, but adapt their principles to our context. He spent the rest of the train ride drafting notes for a speech he would give to Congress, a speech about production targets and industrial mobilization, a speech inspired by what he'd seen in Canada, though he wouldn't mention that explicitly. Americans needed to believe they were leading, not following, even when they were learning from others. The months that followed saw American war production accelerate to unprecedented levels. New factories were built, existing facilities were expanded, more women entered the workforce, rationing was tightened, the entire economy was bent toward a single purpose: victory. Whether this was directly caused by Roosevelt's Canadian visit or would have happened anyway is impossible to say. War production had been increasing throughout 1943. The trend was already established. But Roosevelt's trip seemed to crystallize something in his thinking, seemed to make him realize that America could and should be doing more. In early 1944, Roosevelt requested another statistical analysis comparing American and Canadian war production. The new numbers showed that the gap had narrowed. American per capita output had increased significantly, though Canada still maintained a slight edge in certain categories. We're learning, Roosevelt told Hopkins when reviewing the data. We're getting better. The Canadians are still improving too, Hopkins pointed out. They're not standing still. They're finding new efficiencies, new ways to increase output. I know, but that's good. It means we're all pushing each other to do better. And competition among allies can be healthy if it's channeled properly. By mid-1944, the Allied war production had reached levels that the Axis simply couldn't match. American factories were producing aircraft, ships, and vehicles in staggering quantities. British factories had recovered from the devastation of the Blitz and were producing steadily. Soviet factories, relocated beyond the Urals, were churning out tanks and artillery. And Canadian factories, those efficient operations that had so impressed Roosevelt, continued their relentless output. The invasion of Normandy in June 44 was supported by this production miracle. The thousands of landing craft, the thousands of aircraft, the thousands of vehicles that made D-Day possible all came from Allied factories that had learned to operate at peak efficiency. Canadian forces stormed Juno Beach on June 6th, supported by equipment that had been built in Montreal and Halifax and Toronto by workers like Marie Fontaine and supervised by managers like Margaret Henderson. The tanks worked, the ships worked, the planes worked. The system that Canada had built delivered exactly what was needed, when it was needed, where it was needed. Roosevelt watched the Normandy invasion reports from the White House, tracking the progress of Allied forces across the beaches and into France. He thought about his Canadian visit, about the factories and shipyards, about the workers who'd made all of this possible. He also thought about what Prime Minister King had said, about fighting to prove something, about national identity being forged in the crucible of war. Canada was proving itself in this conflict, thus establishing itself as a nation that mattered on the world stage. In a few years, when the peace was negotiated and the post-war order was established, Canada would have a seat at the table because they'd earned it. America would have a seat too, of course, the dominant seat. The United States would emerge from this war as the world's preeminent power, economically and militarily. But Roosevelt took comfort in knowing that America's neighbors and allies had also risen to the occasion, had also contributed meaningfully to victory. In October 44, Roosevelt was elected to an unprecedented fourth term as president. The election was closer than previous ones had been. The American people were tired of war, tired of sacrifice, eager for peace, but they still trusted Roosevelt to see the conflict through to victory. After the election, Roosevelt received a congratulatory telegram from Prime Minister King. It was formal and diplomatic, as King's communications always were. But there was a postscript, handwritten, that caught Roosevelt's attention. "Franklin," it read, "thank you for understanding what we're trying to achieve. Thank you for seeing Canada as a partner, not just a subordinate. It matters more than you know, William." Roosevelt smiled when he read it. He dictated a response through his secretary. "William, Canada has proven itself beyond any doubt. You have built a war machine that operates with remarkable efficiency and shows no signs of breaking down. When future historians write about this war, they will marvel at what your nation accomplished. I am honored to call you ally and friend." Or Franklin. The winter of 44 to 45 was the last winter of the war in Europe. The Allies were advancing on all fronts. The Soviet Red Army was pushing toward Berlin from the east. British, American, and Canadian forces were advancing through France and the Low Countries toward the Rhine. The end was in sight. Canadian production didn't slow down. If anything, it intensified. They were building equipment for the final push, for the invasion of Germany itself, for whatever came after. The factories ran their triple shifts. The shipyards launched their corvettes. The aircraft plants assembled their bombers. Roosevelt's health was failing by this point, though few people knew how serious it was. The years of stress, the physical toll of leading a nation through depression and war, the cigarettes and late nights and constant pressure, all of it was catching up to him. His doctors were concerned. His staff was concerned. But Roosevelt himself seemed to barely notice. He had work to finish. In February 45, Roosevelt traveled to Yalta to meet with Churchill and Stalin. The conference would determine the shape of the post-war world, divide Germany and Europe into zones of influence, and establish the framework for the United Nations. During a private dinner with Churchill, the British Prime Minister mentioned Canada's war contribution. "They've been extraordinary, Franklin," Churchill said in his rumbling voice. "Simply extraordinary. I don't know what we would have done without them. The ships they've built kept our Atlantic convoys running. The food they've sent fed our population. The men they've trained and deployed have fought with distinction in every theater. They proved they could fight forever," Roosevelt said, repeating the phrase he'd used with Hopkins 2 years earlier. "They found a way to mobilize totally without breaking themselves." Indeed, and they'll emerge from this war stronger than they went in, at least in terms of international standing. They've earned a place among the nations that matter. Roosevelt nodded, though he felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. The Yalta conference was draining what little energy he had left. "Winston," he said quietly, "we need to make sure the post-war order includes Canada properly, not as a British dominion or an American satellite, but as an independent nation with its own voice." Churchill looked at Roosevelt with concern. But the American president looked terrible, gray-faced and drawn. "Of course, Franklin, I couldn't agree more. Canada has earned that respect." Roosevelt returned to Washington after Yalta, exhausted beyond words. He went to Warm Springs, Georgia, his retreat where he'd spent so much time over the years seeking relief from his polio. On April 12, 45, he complained of a headache, lost consciousness, and died of a cerebral hemorrhage. The news reached Ottawa within hours. Prime Minister King was devastated. He'd known Roosevelt for years, had worked with him closely throughout the war, had come to genuinely respect and admire the American president, despite their differences in style and temperament. King ordered flags lowered to half-mast across Canada. He issued a statement praising Roosevelt's leadership and vision. And then, in his diary that night, he wrote something more personal. "Franklin understood what we were trying to accomplish. He saw Canada not as a minor player or a colonial appendage, but as a nation making its own contribution to victory. He respected our sacrifices and acknowledged our achievements. We have lost a friend." The war in Europe ended less than a month later, on May 8, 45. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The fighting in the Pacific would continue until August, when atomic bombs and Soviet entry into the war finally forced Japan to capitulate. Canada's war production finally began to wind down in the summer of 45. The factories started converting back to peacetime goods. The shipyards stopped building corvettes and started considering what merchant vessels might be needed for post-war trade. The aircraft plants began thinking about civilian aviation. The demobilization was massive and complex, just as King had predicted. Over 1 million Canadians in uniform needed to return to civilian life. Factories needed to retool. The economy needed to shift from total war to sustainable peace. It would take years to fully accomplish, but Canada had proven what it set out to prove. It had shown that a middle power could punch well above its weight. It had demonstrated industrial capacity and military prowess that earned respect from allies and enemies alike. It had established itself as a nation that mattered on the global stage. Marie Fontaine, who'd welded tanks in Montreal, went back to work in the garment industry, but she'd learned skills and gained confidence that stayed with her. She eventually opened her own small manufacturing business, applying the lessons she'd learned in wartime production to peacetime enterprise. Margaret Henderson continued managing factories after the war, becoming one of the first women executives in Canadian industry. She never forgot the sense of purpose she'd felt during the war years, the knowledge that her work directly contributed to victory. Captain Peterson, who'd lost his first Corvette to a U-boat, survived the war and stayed in the Navy. He eventually became an admiral, applying the lessons he'd learned about convoy protection to peacetime naval strategy. The factories and shipyards that had produced Canada's war material mostly survived the transition to peace. Some closed, but many adapted, finding new products and new markets. The industrial capacity that had been built up during the war became the foundation for post-war prosperity. In Washington, President Harry Truman, who'd inherited Roosevelt's office and responsibilities, ordered a comprehensive study of Allied war production. The report, completed in late 1945, confirmed what Roosevelt had observed during his Canadian visit. Canada, despite having only 1/12 of America's population, had produced war material at a rate that was proportionally higher in many categories. They'd sustained this production for 6 years without major disruptions or quality failures. They'd proven that a well-organized middle power could make contributions that rivaled those of major powers. The report concluded with a section on lessons learned. It recommended that American industrial planning adopt some of the techniques that had made Canadian production so efficient. Simplified designs, standardized parts, better labor relations, more comprehensive training programs, focus on quality control even when producing at high speed. Many of these recommendations were implemented in American industry in the post-war years. Whether they directly resulted from the study or were part of a broader trend is debatable. But the influence was there, the acknowledgement that Canada had done something worth learning from. Years later, historians would analyze Canada's war production and marvel at the numbers. A nation of 11.5 million people had produced over 800,000 military vehicles of various types. Built over 400 warships from corvettes to destroyers to merchant vessels, manufactured over 16,000 aircraft, trained over 1 million men and women for military service, provided billions of dollars in aid to Britain and other allies, and fed British civilians with food shipments that prevented mass starvation. Done all of this while maintaining quality standards, avoiding major labor disruptions, and sustaining the effort for 6 full years. The mathematics were extraordinary. The achievement was undeniable. Canada had proven it could fight forever, or at least as long as necessary. They'd outlasted the enemy's will and capacity to resist. Roosevelt had seen it coming in 1943 when he'd read that telegram and couldn't make the numbers make sense. And he'd visited their facilities and talked to their workers and managers. He'd understood what was driving them. And he'd realized that Canada represented something important. They represented the proof that democracy could mobilize effectively, that free societies could match or exceed totalitarian states in industrial production, that you didn't need a police state or slave labor to build a war machine. You just needed people who believed in the cause and were willing to work for it. Roosevelt never got to see the final victory. He died a month before Germany surrendered, 4 months before Japan capitulated. But he'd seen enough to know how it would end. He'd seen the production numbers. He'd watched the factories and shipyards. He'd talked to the workers. He'd realized that Canada could fight forever, and in realizing that, he'd understood that the Allies would win. Because if a nation of 11.5 million people could sustain total war for 6 years without breaking, then the combined Allied powers could certainly outlast the Axis. It was just a matter of time and production and will, and all three were on the Allied side.